In this video, we will talk about Paul, the apostle that we see in the book of Acts, and the author of several of the letters in the New Testament. Like with Jesus, it's important to ground Paul in his historical setting to better understand the text that we see in the New Testament. We first encounter Paul in the book of Acts and learn that he was a Roman citizen born in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia. In the ancient world, Roman citizenship was relatively difficult to come by. Unless you were born a Roman citizen, you could only obtain citizenship if you did something to merit it. This becomes important for Paul's missionary journeys later, as he's able to invoke his citizenship, particularly when he is imprisoned. Paul lived sometime between 5 and 64 CE. He was probably born between the years 5 and 15 CE, and lived until 64 CE, which was after the Great Fire of Rome, when many early Christian sources claim he was martyred. Paul was also Jewish. Paul grew up in the city of Jerusalem. While he was born in Tarsus, his family seems to have moved to Jerusalem around the time that he was an infant, or perhaps a young child. Some scholars claim that Paul does not have a foundation in Judaism because he grew up Roman, but this is clearly not the case. Paul seems to understand Judaism quite well, and seems to be a Pharisee based on what we see in the New Testament. We learn that he studied law or Torah under Gamaliel, who was one of the best Jewish teachers of the time. And Paul also learned the trade of tent making or leatherworking. One of the most memorable places that we encounter Paul early on is on his road to Damascus journey. The beginning of this journey, he is persecuting Stephen, who is a disciple and a Christian spreading the good news of Jesus. Paul is notable for persecuting Christians at this point, Stephen being one of them, and later traveling to Damascus to persecute more Christians. This is often misread as Paul hating Christians simply because it was a new religion, but the idea here is that Paul, who is well versed in Jewish law, recognized that Christianity was essentially blasphemy against the Jewish God. As Paul traveled to Damascus on the road to persecute more Christians, he encountered a figure who he believes to be the risen Jesus. He's blinded for 3 days after seeing Jesus, and then travels alone. More than likely, this seems to be some kind of contemplation of how Paul should understand the Torah now in light of his encounter with Jesus. Up to this point, he's quite well versed in Torah, learning again from Gamaliel. But after this experience, he's unsure what to do with this new information. Some people call this road to Damascus trip Paul's conversion, but we also want to remember that Christianity was not necessarily a new religion. It was simply an offshoot of Judaism, a branch of it. After Paul grappled with being able to reconcile his Jewish beliefs with his encounter with Jesus, he preached in the areas of Syria and Cilicia for about 10 years, and seems to have been learning more about Gentile culture since he grew up a Jew in Jerusalem and was not particularly well versed in Gentile culture. One important thing to note as we look at the figure of Paul in the New Testament is the difference between the names Saul and Paul. Many people often misread this, thinking that Saul's name changed with his conversion. But again, we're not looking at a conversion here. This is not Paul changing religions, but simply adapting his religious Jewish beliefs to incorporate his experience with Jesus. Saul is a Hebrew name. In the Hebrew Bible, we see the figure King Saul, who's the first king of Israel. In Hebrew, this is Shaul. Since Paul was Jewish, he was given a Hebrew name, but this was also in addition to his 3 Roman names. Roman citizens had 3 names: a personal name, which would be their first name, their clan name, which would be their second name, and a family name, which would be their third name. Here we see that Saul, or Paul's first or personal name, was in Latin Paulus, which we read as Paul. So this figure that we see here essentially had 4 names, 3 Roman ones, only one of which we know, as well as a Hebrew name because he was Jewish. So this change from Saul to Paul that we see in the New Testament is not because he is changing his name, but simply because he is adapting or going by Paulus to appeal to his Gentile audience more. This is who he's traveling to outside of Jerusalem. Paul is quite notable for his missionary journeys, 3 of which we see in the New Testament. The first of these missionary journeys we see he is accompanied by Barnabas and John Mark. According to the text in Acts, we see that they were sent out by the Holy Spirit to embark on this journey. Paul would arrive in new cities to preach this good news that he learned from Jesus, and would preach in the synagogues. Synagogues were houses of worship for Jews. But there were also God-fearers who gathered here as well. God-fearers were people who were Gentiles, but believed in the Jewish God. After traveling through his first missionary journey, which included preaching to the Jews and recalling the history of Israel to explain how Jesus was the Messiah they anticipated, as well as to the Gentiles to explain that they were now part of this tradition, Paul ended up finishing his missionary journey and returning to Antioch in Syria, then going to the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem Council was a meeting of early church leaders to discuss how Gentiles could be included in this new movement of Christianity. Some Pharisaic Christians argued that all Christians had to follow Jewish law to be saved. The idea here particularly was focused on circumcision and food laws. The people who argued this, such as James, the brother of Jesus, thought that to become Christian, one first essentially had to follow Jewish law. Paul, however, argued that this was not the case. After some discussion, the council determined that Gentiles did not need to uphold Jewish law except for avoiding idolatry and meat that was not ritually butchered. With Silas, Paul then set out on his second missionary journey and returned to churches in Syria and Cilicia to strengthen them. This is one of the things that we'll see throughout studying Paul, is that Paul frequently establishes churches and then returns to the churches to address concerns and help strengthen them in their faith. Paul meets a couple notable people during this journey, including Timothy, who is a half-Jewish and half-Gentile man, who ends up accompanying Paul and Silas on their journey, as well as Lydia in Philippi. In Philippi, Paul goes to the synagogue by the river where he meets this figure Lydia, who's called a God-fearer, again somebody who is Gentile but attending Jewish services because they believed in the Jewish God. Lydia is a dealer of purple cloth from Thyatira. Purple cloth is used for royalty, so Lydia would have been an important figure. And she has her household baptized, indicating that she seems to be the leader of a church at this point. While Paul was in Philippi, he encountered a girl who engaged in divination to earn money for her owners. After casting the demon out of the girl, he ends up losing the Roman owners their profit. This leads to Paul and Silas both being imprisoned for unlawfully converting Romans. While they're in prison, according to the book of Acts, there's a miraculous earthquake, and Paul and Silas are set free, which leads to the conversion of the jailer. When the police, however, found out that Paul was a Roman citizen, they realized that their beating of them was unlawful because of the Roman law, so they were allowed to leave safely. Paul, Silas, and Timothy then stopped in Thessalonica, which is the capital of Macedonia. And here Paul preached at the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths and converted many people. However, there became some tensions here and some resistance. The Jews were jealous that Paul was extending this invitation to convert or to adapt to this new tradition to not only the Jews but also the Gentiles. And the Jews told the Roman authorities that Paul was claiming Jesus was another king. This would be seen as a serious threat to Roman government. Paul had to flee and eventually was rushed on to Athens to avoid persecution, while Silas and Timothy remained behind in Berea. When Paul arrived in Athens, he discovered that the city was full of idolatry, and here he talked to the council of the Areopagites. He noted that they were extremely religious, and explained that they no longer needed to worship an unknown god, since the God they were talking about was the same Jewish or Christian God that Paul worshipped. His speech, which you can see here on the right, which is preserved at Mars Hill, converted Dionysius, who is a high-ranking person and member of this council. Paul also traveled to Corinth, and he stayed here for about 1.5 years, while Silas and Timothy rejoined him. Here he met Aquila and Priscilla. Both were Jewish Christians who had been driven out of Rome, and were tent makers, or leather workers like Paul, and were a married couple. Both Priscilla and Aquila were disciples in this church. After traveling with Priscilla and Aquila and eventually stopping in Ephesus, where Paul preached in the synagogue and Priscilla and Aquila decided to stay and start a church, he went back to Jerusalem and then returned to Antioch in Syria for a while, which ended his second missionary journey. His third missionary journey again was focused on strengthening churches. He traveled with some companions, notably Timothy and possibly Luke, and went back to help these churches that he had established to strengthen them, particularly in the areas of Galatia and Phrygia. He also traveled to Ephesus and stayed there for 3 years, working as a tent maker. It was during this time that he probably wrote 4 letters to the Corinthian church, and possibly made some trips to the Corinthian church as well. Now, if you look in your New Testament, you'll notice that there are only 2 letters. This is because there were probably 4 letters, but we simply do not have 2 of them. As we read 1st and 2nd Corinthians next week, we'll notice that there are places that Paul refers to previous letters, and this indicates that Paul probably wrote 2 other letters to the church in Corinth. Many of Paul's letters are probably written during this journey, not just the Corinthian letters, because as he was traveling and encouraging churches, he was also sending letters to do the same. Paul was going to sail to Syria after his time in Ephesus, but he found out about a plot against him by the Jews, and this caused him to travel by land through Macedonia instead. He stopped in several cities like Philippi, Troas, and Caesarea on the way, and strengthened churches and began others there, finally arriving in Jerusalem, which ended his 3rd and final missionary journey. When Paul returned to Jerusalem, he was warned by James and other apostles that some of the Jews were claiming Paul was not upholding the law, since he was teaching Gentiles that they could be Christian without following the law of Moses, or the Torah. Despite performing a Jewish rite of purification, Paul was assaulted by these Jews because he was allowing Gentile Christians to pass beyond the court of the Gentiles, which was considered a capital offense. Because of this, Paul was arrested by the Romans and was taken to Caesarea, where he was imprisoned for 2 years. When there was a new governor, Paul was going to be sent back to Jerusalem for trial, but instead invoked his Roman citizenship to be taken to Rome for a trial before Caesar. Paul and his companions traveled by ship to Rome, but shipwrecked on the island of Malta for 3 months before continuing to Rome. When Paul was taken to Rome as a prisoner, he was placed under house arrest for 2 years with a Roman soldier guarding him. While under house arrest, he still preached the good news to Jews and Gentiles, quote, with all boldness and without hindrance. Although Paul's companions no longer stayed with him, Timothy probably came to visit him. More than likely, Paul wrote the prison letters, or the ones that are undisputedly written by Paul during his time under house arrest. And these are the texts of Philemon, Philippians, Ephesians, and Colossians. While the New Testament does not tell any more of Paul's story after his house arrest, many early Christian sources claim that Paul was murdered and decapitated by Emperor Nero, perhaps as a result of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which was blamed on Christians. As I mentioned earlier, there are some texts that are considered Pauline letters, but are disputed whether Paul wrote or not. The Pauline letters refers to the texts in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul. Most scholars leave Hebrews out of this because it never claims to be written by Paul, and it's not actually a letter but a sermon, which we'll talk about later in the course. The mostly undisputed texts, which most scholars believe were actually written by Paul the Apostle, are the texts of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Again, we have other texts, such as 2 other letters to the Corinthians, that were written by Paul, but we simply do not have. Letters that are disputed whether Paul wrote them or not are called Deutero-Pauline, meaning Second Pauline. 2 of the disputed texts are Colossians and 2nd Thessalonians. Scholars cannot agree on whether Paul actually wrote these letters or not, so these are categorized somewhere in the middle. We also have pseudonymous texts. These texts are ones that most scholars claim were not written by Paul. One of these is the letter to the Ephesians, which seems to have been a circular letter to multiple churches and not just to the one in Ephesus, as well as the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are focused on teaching the figures to whom they are addressed on how to run churches. These letters are 1st and 2nd Timothy, as well as Titus. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain who Paul was, including his citizenship and his inclusion in Christianity, describe Paul's missionary journeys, and explain the authorship of the Pauline letters in the New Testament.